Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is, wherever you are, welcome to the Good Values Podcast. Now this is going to be part 2 of my conversation with Paul Heaston. If you haven't seen the previous episode, then I will leave a link here. And in this episode, we discuss several aspects of the urban sketching process and a little bit more about Paul's background. I think it's a fantastic conversation and I really hope you enjoy it. So here is part 2 of my conversation with Paul Heaston. On your Instagram, you've also shown that you made the adjustment to digital work quite easily and naturally, which other artists such as myself really struggle with. Was it Procreate that you were drawing in?
Yes, right now for the most part it's Procreate. I had some experience digitally painting with Photoshop, and I took a digital imaging course, dating myself way back in 1997 in university, and where we were taking photos with a film camera and scanning the negatives, that kind of thing. And Photoshop 2.0, something like that, very, very early version. And so I had a little bit of familiarity with Photoshop and the limited things that it could do. But it wasn't, I think, until I went to graduate school and acquired a student license for a new Photoshop, whichever one was around 2005, that I kind of reacquainted myself with sort of digital painting. But it was a little sort of a side pursuit, nothing serious. And until my friend Rob Sketcherman from Hong Kong, also in Manchester, he took me aside. He showed me Procreate. It's phenomenal. This is 2016. And then he talked to my wife and said, you need to get him on Procreate. But I didn't have an iPad at the time or any kind of tablet. I had a Wacom Intuos thing for
stylus.
Yes, just the tablet stylus thing, non-screen,
Yeah.
for very seldom used, and for my desktop computer. So as a Christmas present, Linda got me an iPad, and it was immediately, I loved the interface. I loved how intuitive Procreate was. And how powerful it was. It was shockingly powerful I thought, apps just didn't have the same power and versatility as, a desktop application. Something on an iPad, I didn't realize it could be, such an amazing sort of tool. So I was really, I was really doing that for a while, a lot. And I come back to it from time to time, and it's a way I can kind of indulge my painting muscles again, and exercise that desire to paint without having to have a big messy studio full of expensive oil paints. So I'll do a lot of these sort of car portraits. They're sort of almost caricatured cars, and they're in full color because I can devote a little bit more time to it, and it's not messy, and and I can sit out on the sofa and listen to a podcast or watch TV at the same time, which is nice. And I didn't have a studio for the longest time after graduate school that I could paint in anyway, so out of necessity, I think sketching and the ease of the portability of sketching was very appealing to me. And the same thing is true with Procreate, and there's just the ease and portability of just having a tablet and a little stylus and the Apple Pencil. So it's I don't do a lot of observational sketching with it. Every now and then I'll pull it out at a coffee shop and do some, but not as often as I'm using just pen and ink.
I've seen you do the caricature-esque style on vehicles, which is really nice because it reminds me of old cartoons and how they design vehicles, and things like, I don't know if it's the Jetsons or something like that, where they kind of have these beautiful marks and just lines of making something slightly more simplified, but kind of just charming as well, to sort of show the character of the vehicle. I was wondering as well, do you draw from imagination?
Yeah, from time to time. I'm not as good at that as I'd like to be. Um, and I think I like observational drawing because it's sort of an open book test in the sense that everything that you need to know is right in front of you, and you don't have to depend on your brain to supply the details or the information. And it's one of those funny things that you teach if you teach drawing or sketching, you emphasize the idea that mostly you need to communicate. Your eyes and hands need to communicate, and your brain doesn't need to be a part of the conversation as much, because our brain has a way of interjecting false sort of knowledge about how things look like,
Yeah.
like you have these visual formulas in your head for what like an eyeball looks like. I think as children we all know an eyeball looks like an almond with a circle in the center, right?
Yeah.
Which that's not what an eye looks like.
No,
Once you start to try and draw a portrait, you're like, oh, uh-oh. And a bicycle is like a triangle with two circles. Well, no bicycle in the wild looks like that. I mean, and so it's important to kind of trust what you're seeing rather than your brain's idea of what you're seeing. And so I think I've come along that line of thinking so far that it's hard for me to draw from, and I should have sort of a repository in my head of what things look like, but I'm not like as skilled as, say, a concept artist or visual development artist at just generating those images out of nothing. I'd like to be, but every time I try it, I get very frustrated. But using references and resources is fine, and there's a lot of people who do that. So,
well, beyond what your eye can see and what your hand can measure, you do have the ability to render your environment I've seen at coffee shops or restaurants where you do the fisheye effect of perspective, which is tricky, I think. I mean, I've done it a couple of times, but not with a certainty. It's always experimentation because I've not got a formula for that. And how is it you do that? Do you have a formula, or do you just have this learned practice that you do?
It's mostly practiced. I came about it sort of from the back end after thinking about perspective in buildings. I set up a project for myself when I returned to Montana after my semester in Italy. And there was an artist, this is a long story, but it's interesting. So there's an artist, a pop artist named Ed Ruscha. And among the things that he did was a photography project called All the Buildings on the Sunset Strip. And he stood across the street from every building on the Sunset Strip, which is just a stretch of, a street in Hollywood, and took a photo of all these buildings and then sort of collaged them together. And then he went across the street and took a from the other side and photographed all of the buildings. And then he had them printed on an accordion sketchbook, or just an accordion style book, not a sketchbook, with one set of prints sort of upside down because it was the across the street. And I'd seen that at the LA County Museum of Art years and years ago. And it just stuck with me. I remembered that project. And I thought, well, Bozeman has, where I lived, is a small town. So it's about 5 blocks sort of the city center, all on one street, Main Street, and or High Street, I suppose. But it's called Main Street in Bozeman. And I thought, I bet I could draw every building in that one sort of historic stretch of town. Bunch of beautiful old brick buildings, and then I'd cross the street and do the other. And I had a little panoramic, not an accordion at the time, but a panoramic sketchbook, just a landscape format. And I thought, okay, I'll try it. And I thought, it's like an interesting project to see them drawn rather than photographed. And so I did that. And as I was doing it, there are some buildings that are taller. There's like, I think the tallest building in the city is 8 stories. And in order to effectively fit it on the page, I had to squash the rest of the street, the buildings, make them smaller, And as they were smaller, I realized that, well, that means that my field of view is wider. And so I was looking off to the right, which means that, oh, it's going to go basically to the end of the block. You can see as the buildings sort of taper. And I was familiar. I've had, big group photos, your school photo or whatever, the panoramic photo.
Yeah.
I'd seen those. And I think at the time, Google Street View was starting to appear too. And so we were all becoming more familiar with these sort of fisheye lens photos and the panoramic photos and the curvature that happens. And of course, David Hockney, famous British artist, used to do these photo collages too, which my mother had always done these too. When we were looking at something very big, she would just take snapshots and then lay them out in the photo album all next to each other, like a bridge or something like that. And David Hockney did these photo collages that ended up having these very fisheye qualities to them. So I started experimenting on that project with curving the buildings so that I could squish them into the space. And then I was like, well, I'm sort of capturing my field of view here. So that became a sort of a goal unto itself, was how can I capture my entire field of view in the little sort of rectangular space of a sketchbook? Mm-hmm. And it was a challenge, and I didn't really understand the perspective problem yet, but I was sort of figuring it out, sort of trial and error style. But then I think as I was also learning more about other urban sketchers, I ran into the work of Gérard Michel, the Belgian sketcher, and he has on his Flickr page these perspective experiments, these wide angle perspective experiments that he would do on location. And I ran into other artists. Rackstraw Downs was a painter in the 70s and 80s who were doing these wide angle plein air paintings. And of course, it also brought me back to looking at Escher again. And I had, any artist kid goes through sort of a little Escher phase where they're just, those are so much fun to look at. Yeah. And I had an Escher book, and I was looking at his, his spherical self-portrait and a bunch of other things that he'd done, playing with perspective. And so I gradually got more and more comfortable with the idea of it. And from time to time, I would try and figure out sort of how do you lay this out in a grid. And then it got to the point where I started teaching it, and I had to figure out the perspective of it. So I had to kind of teach myself, well, if you were to draw a grid, what would it look like? What are the rules here that I've been following sort of intuitively and by feel? Because I wanted to know the rules before I broke them. Because I'm not I don't follow these rules mathematically, but I like having that information, in my head. And to know when I'm deviating from some of those rules is kind of fun. You can figure out what ways to play with it. But I don't, for the most part, plan or draw a grid or lay things out any more than I just sort of block in the shapes. If I'm using pencil first at all, and often is the case, I don't use pencil. I'll just sort of dive right in, and I start foreground to background. And I find that starting with my immediate foreground with the hands in the sketchbook helps me set up the composition. It's the scale and the proportions kind of fall into place like dominoes from that. Because most of us, I think, we tend to start with, if I said draw this space, you're going to start with the back of the room and trying to work your way out towards the edges of the composition, and you'll invariably run out of space, or you'll get lost a little bit. And it helps if you work your way back into the spaces, because then you can't get lost. Everything is going to have to be, is building off of the initial proportions you've established at the beginning.
Yeah, well, it works beautifully, and it makes perfect sense. So obviously, if you work from the back forward, you might not make it into the picture yourself in your hand.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, this may sound a bit strange, but are there any shortcuts or tricks that you're able to kind of gift other artists with? I mean, I'm trying to think of an example, because there's certain things that I've said to younger artists to try to bestow upon them, things which I've learned either the hard way or through being taught. And it'll be things like things into the distance, if you're painting, become bluer, because they just have a tint of blue and they become more faded in tonally equivalent with the sky almost, as they recede into the distance. Or if you're doing a building, try to find a strong light source so that you can define the light and shadow so that you've got a strong contrast to describe things like that, which are, it's not a trick as in a cheat, but it's a trick as in it's something which you've learned which may be overlooked by beginner artists. Is there anything which you
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a rules of thumb. I mean, that's absolutely true. And I think the tip of working foreground to background is, sort of paramount importance if you're trying to do a drawing that sort of encompasses more of your field of view. There are others sort of similar to that. Like, I think it's important to remember the diminution of scale and foreshortening. Those types of things are a challenge even for me every single time I sketch, right? What's wrong with foreshortening is that however foreshortened you think it should be, it's probably half that distance. I mean, it's one of those things. So that's one of those rules of thumb I've often told students is like, however skinny you think that that receding plane is, make it skinnier. Similarly, however dark in terms of value, however dark you think you can go darker. Because it's hard to underscore maybe the importance of value in suggesting volume and in suggesting three-dimensionality. And those things are sort of very important, and people get carried away with just shape and line quality, and the value can really suggest so much. And shadows are so important, and because our brain is often naming things and naming objects, we often just sort of ignore what we think are superfluous details, information that isn't important to understanding the information in front of us, but so you kind of ignore values. Your brain does, you ignore shadows, and thinking about those shadows is super important. Because they're doing the heavy lifting of making everything feel real. And like you said, of course, atmospheric perspective. If you're a pen and ink artist, it's a trickier thing to do than if you work as a painter. But line quality and less detail are things to sort of make sure that you're using nice thin lines for stuff that's way off in the background, and barely suggest anything back there at all, or maybe go entirely with your like a grayscale brush or something like that. I'm trying to think of another rule of thumb that's sort of a fun one. Most of the time, in terms of composition, people put and this is so funny because we just saw this movie, The Fabelmans, the Spielberg movie. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've not seen it. Is it good?
It's very good. And at the end of the movie, I don't want to spoil anything, but there's the character is supposed to be sort of like Steven Spielberg. It's sort of semi-autobiographical, and he meets the great Western director, John Ford. And John Ford gives him some compositional advice, and it's about where you place the horizon in a composition. And most people will sort of center the horizon, and there's as much information above the horizon as below the horizon. But by changing the location of the horizon, you can make things much more dynamic. And when people do that, most of the time they lower the horizon and try to get these sort of soaring things up above the horizon. But when I draw interiors, I put the horizon up high in the composition, and then that sense of space and this interior stretching away from you really starts to become more and more dynamic. And that's just something I think some knowledge I gained through trial and error over the years. And it's not something I specifically think about, but then when I saw the movie and heard him talk about that, I was like, oh yeah. It's when I find I learn a lot about my own work when other people point out things to me. They noticed, because I don't know, I'm not often aware of the things that I do, but somehow by intuition or by making a ton of mistakes in the past, I have trained my subconscious to just avoid certain things or to do certain things a certain way, and I'm not even cognizant that I'm doing it that way until somebody else will point it out to me. Linda's particularly good at that. She's, my wife, she's very she can say, oh, this works because this. And I go, oh yeah, you're right. Okay.
Yeah, I've had that with my brother. Usually what frustrates me is my brother will say, if you crop it here, the composition is sound. And I just won't understand. Even when he tells me and I look at it afterwards, I just think, maybe it's the golden section. I'm not sure. I don't know what this additional part is how it's affecting the piece, and I can't always see it. So that's something which frustrates me, even though I try to learn composition. And the cinema, I think, is a great influence on artwork for me, especially because it's certain directors, just where you put the camera speaks volumes of the emotion and the kind of character of the environment. And I do appreciate that, in how you can sit in traffic and then all of a sudden be entertained and perfectly amused just looking out the window at, observing certain textures and certain depth and details. And oh, they've got a gutter, and then behind the gutter they've got this little thing. I never would have thought of drawing that. And I always seeing things in artistic terms, I suppose.
Yeah, and that brings me to another point, which was, I'm trying to remember who I was talking to about this, but it might have been Gurney had a recent post about sort of the painting of this sort of banal subject matter, and what is beautiful and what isn't, and it's those things like you're talking about. I think that they can be extraordinarily interesting. The sort of so-called street furniture, that we tend to think of, like the big things, like the buildings, as sort of important, or the landscape. But when I started sort of going out and sketching, I found that, well, literally there's a bunch of cars in front of everything. And I knew a lot of people who would avoid the cars. And I thought, well, no, the cars are as much a part of the landscape as anything else. So I was sketching the cars, and I was sketching the little electrical boxes that stick up out of the sidewalk, and mailboxes and trash bins, and street signs and things stuck to trees. And and it was sort of like, if it's there, I've always been of this sort of philosophy that I have kind of a responsibility to acknowledge it somehow. And I know a lot of people who, maybe in the interest of aesthetics, would sort of selectively omit, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's just simply a different way of operating as an artist. But I'm somebody who's much more interested in, like, every little gruesome detail.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's all beautiful. Okay, so that is part 2 done. Now, I loved that chat. I think that all of these parts of the conversation are fantastic. There is a third part next week, so tune in for that. Support Paul with all the links in the description below. He has books for sale, he has his social media accounts. He's a fantastic person, so please support him. But I really appreciate you watching. If you did enjoy this episode, then please leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, share this with friends and family, and spread it around as much as possible. I really want the channel to grow, and with your help it will. But I appreciate you watching. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next episode.